Program Director at the Jefferson Education Society, and Joe Butoriak, lifelong NRA member. Can one of you guys switch on the mic if it's not on? It's on the bottom underneath. So thank you guys so much for being here tonight. Maybe we can start with your general impressions on the film, and then we'll open it up and see where we go. Ben, you want to start?
Sure. Hello. I thought the scene at the restaurant, where you could barely get a word in edgewise, and the four of them are barking at each other at one point, I think really captures this debate, the essence of this debate, and this conversation, and why it's such a hard one to have, and why we're still coming to terms with what it means to have a right to bear arms 200 years after the fact. Those are really good film.
That scene reminded me that no matter what we discuss here and we argue, we're all going to walk out that door feeling the same way that we came in. This is one of those topics, religion, abortion, gun control, that we've all got strong feelings of, and no matter what we talk about, we're all going to feel the same way.
I agree. I mean, it was a very thought-provoking film. It's a very topical issue right now. We have a presidential election coming up, and I'm sure this is going to be one of the issues that's going to be discussed at the debate. It hasn't been that much so far that I've seen in the primaries, but I think it's one that we'll see further. It's one that certainly President Obama has kept in the forefront for the last several years of his administration, and this really kind of opened up some different ideas and some different thoughts on the gun control debate.
Andy, if I can ask, how many years have you worked with the ATF, and have you seen any change, I guess, in the general situation of gun violence and the things that you do?
I've been with ATF since the year 2000 actually. I've been in Washington, D.C., St. Paul, Minnesota, Pittsburgh, and now here in Erie. And what's interesting is to see the way different states, that's one of the issues in the gun control discussion, is the states are so different in terms of what the rules are, what the regulations are, what their reporting requirements are. So every time I move, I have to kind of learn some new state rules. The federal rules stay the same. But with the state, Pennsylvania is different from Minnesota in terms of private party sales of handguns. So that's one of the things that is tough to kind of control, because each state has their own right to come up with whatever laws they want. I've not seen, a lot of different legislation that's been passed since I've been on with ATF since 2000. I guess maybe the biggest change was the sunsetting of the assault weapons ban. I didn't really see that big of a change in that, just because I think that law was more of a cosmetic law than anything else, where it basically said if you have more than 2 scary features on your gun, it's now an illegal gun. But the fact of the matter is it still fires the same way. It still does just as much damage. It just looks different. That's something that they're going to get into the debate here in terms of the assault weapons and whether they're needed for private party or private citizen use. We deal with a heroin epidemic here in Erie, and I can discuss more about how that affects the gun trafficking trade here in Erie. But John had asked about laws that have seemed to have changed, and I can just say that one of the laws that actually we've seen a huge change in, or that really benefited, was surprisingly when they moved the Sudafed behind the counters. We saw a dramatic decrease in the number of meth labs when I was stationed in Minnesota, which at that time was one of the biggest states for meth abuse in the country. And I don't know how that affected things in Pennsylvania, but it just shows that sometimes, congressmen and legislators can get together and pass legislation that doesn't impose that big of a burden on us as citizens, but actually can produce good results from a community safety standpoint.
Yeah, there's a difference also in the way some of these laws are written and interpreted. Speaking specifically about what's generally called the Stand Your Ground law, I don't know how it's written about in Florida, but it's written entirely different up here. I'm familiar with what it is in Pennsylvania. And in Pennsylvania, it's more of an extension of the Castle Doctrine. which means that when you were in your house, you didn't have to find a way to get out of your house if somebody came into the house. It was just meant to where now you don't have to leave where you're at if somebody attacks you. I don't know about what they did down in Florida with that, but that's the way it was written here in Pennsylvania, and I think you'll see that we haven't had as much problems with it here in Pennsylvania as what they've had in other places. I would like to say one thing about the intros, that I'm not right now actively an NRA member. Their politics sort of got in the way of what I felt. When they decided to back Mitt Romney for president, I said, I can't countenance that. So they went in different directions from me, and there's a lot of things politically that I had problems with them. I still believe in a lot of the things that they do, but I haven't been a member for a few years.
I think that one of the particularly interesting things this movie reveals, I don't know that if it touches on it as much as maybe I'd like to, but it's the reasoning that people often give to have a right to arms. And so there's a clear difference between a right to arms as a hobby. The preacher talks about the excitement of doing that, and we see him at a shooting range and practicing, and it being a hobby, and seeing why people are attracted to that. But more often than not, it seems the case in America, we use that as defense, that's our valid reason of owning guns, is in defense, and whether that's tied to the idea that we're born on militias as far as the country is concerned, and we evolved as cowboys as far as the country is concerned, and that our history is not nearly as long as other countries. We seem to be preoccupied with defending ourselves and using guns to do so, and using guns not necessarily as a recreation, but as a defense mechanism. And I think that's part of what makes this an interesting discussion of when a gun becomes something that we use to defend ourselves and then inevitably take a life. And I think that it becomes a more complicated discussion when somebody says, well, if you're going to outlaw guns and you're going to outlaw bullets because they kill people, you should do the same thing with a car. When I think of intent, what's the intent of a gun? What's the intent of a car? A car is not designed and built to kill somebody. A car is designed as a tool to get us from point A to point B. A gun, we then have to think of what's the definition of a gun and why do we have them? Are these something that we equate to a football where we go out to a field and we toss it around? We use this as a hobby. This is something we just do and pass time with, or is this something that we use to defend ourselves? Is it a weapon? And so it's really a perception issue when it comes down to trying to understand this, and I think have a more mature and adult conversation about what guns mean to Americans.
Yeah, I'm 65 years old now, I'll be 66 in a week or so, and I've been a hunter since I was 12 years old. I've also had a concealed weapon permit for over 40 years now, and for 12 years I was a competitive combat pistol shooter. In fact, in 1997, I was a top revolver shooter in the country. In fact,
Very safe.
as a
Now we're even more safe.
in show and tell, I brought along the revolver that I did that with. I had a great time with it. It ate up a lot of my spare time and a whole lot of my money. But I'm semi-retired in that now. I still go out and shoot every once in a while, and that's kind of like, you know, when I talk about guns, that's what they are to me. I don't look at them as weapons. I don't look at them as something I'm going to go out and kill somebody or something with. As a matter of fact, I haven't really hunted in 5 years because I, frankly, just got tired of killing things. But, you know, they're hobby and fun things to me, and they're not tools for killing anybody, although I do carry concealed now and then, and I'm not ashamed of that, and I don't do it out of fear. I just do it because 40 years ago I made a decision to do that, and that's just the way I live.
One of the interesting things I saw there was the discussion about what it takes to get a firearms carry permit. And the guy had mentioned about, you know, having your finger on the outside of the trigger and point it and make it go click in a safe direction, and you're walking out with your license the next day. And again, I think states are different in terms of how they issue that. But you think of, you know, that immediately came to my mind when I saw that on the film was, think about what you have to go through to get a driver's license. I mean, you have to take a written test, you have to do a practical test. It's not a guaranteed pass by any means. But to possess a gun that you can walk out of there with a license that day, I thought it was a little bit frightening. And I think that, I always tell people, friends of mine ask me, I want to get a gun for protection. What do you think I should get? And I always just tell them the same thing, which is if you're going to buy a gun, if you're going to carry a gun, if you're going to have a gun in your house, you have to know how to use it. You have to have lessons. You have to have instruction above and beyond what what they tell you at the when you get your permit. Basically, take a class. Find a local range, take a class, become familiar with it, so there is no doubt in your mind that you're not going to hurt yourself or somebody else accidentally with this firearm. So yeah, a question in the back.
Yeah, so a lot of the times when things like this come up and the defense is, good guy kills a bad guy with a gun, it's like in these mass shooting situations, and a lot of time you're talking about really troubled people with firearms going in and hurting children, going into a church, hurting for, these horrific situations. I was a senior in high school when Columbine happened, and I think that was like the first time I really processed mass violence perpetrated by young troubled people. And now that's something we're just used to. I also, this follows up with what you're talking about getting a permit so easily or buying a gun so quickly. Last year, I lost a friend to suicide who had mental health problems, and he was able to go to the Erie sports store and buy a gun, but he had an extensive mental health history. So that, in light of that, and in light of a lot of these troubled people who are kind of perpetrating some of these mass shootings, where does that fall in? I know it's medical information, it's private, right? HIPAA protects people's personal, health information, but that seems to be where a lot of the problems are, right? There's no way to protect someone from themselves when, they've got a mission and they've got to go get a gun to carry that out, whether that's against themselves or a group of children. What are your thoughts on that, I guess?
And I can see Ben's wheels turning, so I'm going to pass it to Ben.
Sure. Well, I was going to take that a step further and say there are an inordinate amount of loopholes state to state in terms of gun shows, in terms of buying, from private user to private user, buying online. I'm sure if any one of us pulled out our smartphones right now and went to Craigslist and looked for available firearms, would be able to find something, be able to drive less than a half hour, make a transaction in cash, and suddenly have a gun. And so I think that that's revealing of the problem in terms of regulating such a thing. And I think that goes back to Andy's point of just how much you have to go through to be able to drive a car. How many of us didn't pass our first driver's test? There are some of us in the room that didn't go so well the first time, and we had to study again, and we had to learn more and do better and go and take the test again. And then if you failed a second time, at least in Pennsylvania, at least when I took it, there was that if you failed a third time, you had to wait a much, much longer time before you had a chance to take it again, because apparently you weren't really good at that and you weren't trusted to operate a vehicle. Yet we can make a pretty easy and simple transaction for a firearm, a weapon, something that we still do perceive as a weapon. So, I don't think that the Second Amendment in any way that people say that, they're trying to take guns from us, we're trying to pry them from people's hands. I think we're just trying to create a better world in terms of safety, in terms of regulation. I don't know that the Second Amendment guarantees that you're standard issued a gun as an American. You have a right to be able to arm yourself. Really, if we want to form a militia, that's part of the Second Amendment that's really important to understand, is that a well-ordered militia is indeed necessary for our safety. I don't know how many people are part of a militia right now because they feel that the government's going to rise up and that we have to, as a militia, fight back. Not that we'd really even do anything against the government, because it's pretty big at this point. And it wasn't at the point that this was written or based on laws in England at the time that this was a common law for them and it was written. So it's interesting, but Eric, you have a great point, just how easy it is to get a gun. I think access to that's one of the most troubling things, and that's where we need stronger legislation in terms of just making the world a bit safer and understanding that. To the HIPAA discussion and mental health and how we can better regulate that, I'm not a medical expert, so I don't know that I can answer that, but I think that in some way background checks have to be something that's much more important when it comes to buying a firearm, or comes to somebody showing up at an expo and being able to buy a firearm the same day if they have a cash transaction right there and walk away with it. Or make bullets really expensive. I don't think Sarah Palin knows how much a bullet costs. Maybe if it cost $50,000, I'd be a little more careful.
Just in the terms of self-defense and along those lines, with the cutback everywhere of police departments and safety officers, people that are able to respond to someone who has a situation, I'm fortunate that I don't live in an area that's high crime. But if I lived in an area that was, I'm not sure that I wouldn't feel uncomfortable in my home if I didn't have some sort of defense on my own, because there's only 2 cops in the city. They're not going to get to my house fast enough. You know what I mean? And I'm thinking, does that add to it when you hear about all these towns that don't have police departments anymore? They're covered by the state police. Is that, you think, part of people's concern too, that they're not out there protecting? What am I going to do?
I'll say really quickly, I think that that's something that's been a continuum throughout American history, that we can't rely on the government, or we can't rely on officials to protect us. We have to protect ourselves. And I think that goes back to, again, our frontiersman nature of, government's not out on the front lines defending you against a bear. Government's not out there defending you against the Native Americans who may attack you. Therefore, you have to defend yourself. And I think that we try to translate that, because that's not all too distant from our memories. We try to translate that of cops aren't going to get there quickly enough, or first responders are not going to be there quickly enough. And if they do show up, they're not adequately prepared. I think that's why you see the over-militarization of police, where they look like they're in SWAT combat gear every time they show up. That's terrifying in and of itself. But I think that becomes this snowball effect of back and forth of, well, if we think that there's a perception of more crime in an area, we militarize the police. And if we can't militarize them enough more quickly to have numbers, then we'll give them semi-automatic weapons. Then we see semi-automatic weapons on the streets, then we give the police automatic weapons, and then there's bullets. So I think that it's just a back and forth nature, but I don't know that the threat's there. Historically, we're in the most peaceful time of the planet. I know that doesn't sound right, especially with what happened just in Brussels the other day, but globally we are in a very safe time. That fear might be there, but even though violent crime, for instance, is on the rise in Erie, not all by that much. I know that we hear about it often. It's still a relatively safe period of time to live in Erie, Pennsylvania. It's a remarkably safe city, despite the fear that violence is out there.
Yeah, I'm very pro-police, but the fact is the police are not there to protect you. The police are there to protect society. This has been run through the courts numerous times. You can't sue the police because they weren't there when you called them. I had another train of thought, but I'll get back to it.
Yeah, that's the common. I know that that's becoming more and more the case where you hear that people want to buy. I think that if you go to any of the gun stores, they probably tell you that their numbers over the last 5 years or so have gone up dramatically in terms of sales and things like that. I know from talking to the sheriff here in Erie that they're at an all-time record right now for the number of concealed carry permit applications that are coming in. And every time you have another one of these mass shootings, the price of ammunition, the price of certain types of guns go up. Threats of the new legislation always panics people into buying guns and doing that. And it's a personal decision in terms of protecting yourself and having a gun in the house. Again, the statistics show that if you have a gun in your house, you yourself or a family member is much more likely to be injured by that gun than if you didn't have that gun there. And so that's something I always just tell people: if you have it, again, make sure you're responsible with it. It's locked away, it's secure. I always your serial numbers are written down someplace. We actually have a form. I wish I brought some tonight, but I can get some because if your gun is stolen from you, and these are the burglary, and that's a common thing here in the Erie County area now, is you have a lot of heroin addicts they're breaking into houses and stealing things. And one of the best things they like to find is a gun that they can take into the streets of Erie and trade for drugs. Make sure your serial numbers are recorded, because if you call the police and you say, my gun was stolen, and you don't have the serial number, we can't get that into the stolen gun database, which means that if somebody's pulled over, 2 hours later and they've got your gun, we won't be able to make that connection right away unless that serial number is recorded into the system.
Are those forms available online?
They are actually up on the ATF website. I think it's, I'm trying to remember the personal firearms form. I have a whole stack of them right down at 100 State Street. So I can actually drop some off here at the museum for people that want to come back and pick them up, or just call me down at the ATF office. We're in the phone book. We're near the beginning of it, so we're easy to find. I saw another question in the back somewhere.
Yeah, it's just the way and a lot of people think these days is that there's so many guns out there that, my God, I better have one, because the people who want to use guns aggressively may be coming for you. And in more and more situations, we see more and more shootings in places where you would never have dreamed that there would be a shooting. And the more regulation that you try to apply to the problem, the law-abiding people are the ones who are going to turn in the guns or not get the guns, and the criminals will find them because they have an endless cache of a stockpile of guns in the black market. So I don't know how it's a very difficult thing to deal with. I mean, if you have too many guns, you have too many people shot. If you start taking away guns, you have a lot less safety with law-abiding people, and you have the possibility of tyranny and other types of very negative things.
Any regulations you put into place, any laws you pass, are only going to affect law-abiding people.
Right.
The criminals, the bad guys, are always going to have their guns. The point that I was going on to before was that nationally, the crime rate is way down from what it's been. It keeps on going down by FBI figures. It's down further than it ever has been before. A lot of that is, well, there's various explanations for what's caused it. And going back to some of the things that Eric had mentioned before, your chances of being involved in an active shooter confrontation, well, you all know how slim your chances are of winning $1 million in the lottery. Well, your chances of being involved in an active shooter confrontation are actually, you have a 5 times greater chance of winning $1 million in the lottery than being involved in an active shooter confrontation. It makes it seem like when you watch the national news that you're going to run into one of these anytime, sometime in your life. It's very unlikely that this is going to happen. You see them happen all the time on the news and you think, oh my God, it's going to happen to me any day. It just doesn't happen that way. They're very rare, but it's just that you see them all the time on the news and you think, my God, it's happening everywhere all the time.
Plane crash.
Yeah. I'll put my media hat on for a second and say we're certainly to blame for that. The media unfortunately plays an awful role in that, of either not intentionally per se, but glorifying the people that commit these atrocities by playing over and over and over again, and we have this same reaction of just befuddlement that we have no idea how this happened or how we could let this possibly happen again. And you start subbing out the locations and the schools and the other facilities it's happening, then it does seem like it's happening so often. And certainly we have to work to stop that. But it's just, it seems so common and overplayed, and so much attention being paid to it on the media that I think it's much. It cuts to our core a little more deeply because of the amount of time that we focus on it, the amount of time that we spend, talking about this, worrying about this, and then following that up a day to 2 days later with, are you safe in your home kind of stories that you see from mainstream media. That's where it's even sadder is that we see that follow up afterwards, and we see that playing on that tinge of fear of, you could be next. Are you ready for this? Something you're doing at your dinner table now at 6 o'clock could kill you. Tune in at 11 to find out. That kind of coverage is just, it's awful.
I'm a senior citizen. am legal. I took my last gun class, was $300 in Colorado. It cost me another, for 2 days, 8 hours, 2 days class. Then I went out the range, it was another $59 to shoot. And I hit the target. I do have my guns, they're safely contained. But I'll tell you what, when I go out in the street, I carry a big whistle. But I do have my guns. But the thing is, when you are, I'm not gonna say I live alone, because I will shoot. If anybody comes to my door and I don't know them, and they don't want to answer, I'll shoot first and ask questions later. I live in the ghetto, which was a nice neighborhood 100 years ago. It's ghetto now. Shootings all around me. And it's a good part of ghetto. But I am not afraid to carry. I don't mind being a member of NRA. And I will use the weapon, the gun, if I have to. Now, is that wrong for a 76-year-old female?
Well, I think the most important part of what you said is the list of classes you took that you rattled off. And I think that goes back to what Andy's been saying so much, and yeah, I couldn't agree more with. I mean, I grew up in rural Pennsylvania where, you know, upon birth you were issued a gun and a Bible, so I understand that kind of context of growing up with guns. But you know, I at the age of 5 was learning to clean guns, and I wasn't allowed to touch ammunition until I was 7 or 8, and then it was, you know, just loading a gun, not even firing it. There was a sort of reverence that was paid to what this thing was and how it operated. So, underway, and I was enrolled in you know, the Boy Scout-esque shooting course and things like that. So again, it's responsible gun ownership that's very, very different. You know, one of the things I would point out, you know, I did not expect to see a gun on stage tonight and was a little startled by it at first, but you know, Joe's got it, it's not loaded. That's a really important thing too, is that, you know, we as much as we might be quick to say that we have a gun problem, we have a bullet problem in that we're allowed to carry armed weapons with us at all times. Take Finland, for instance. There are 30 guns per 100 people there. Shootings are way less than America. Why? You can't transport ammo unless you're going from place to place, so you have to keep it in storage. And to own a gun, you have to register it. One of the reasons of registration you have to provide is why you want this gun. A non-valid reason is self-defense. That's not even a valid reason there, because they don't have the sense that they have to defend themselves with guns. So if you want a gun, it's for a hobby, it's for a recreation. So the mindset's a bit different. And they look at ammo really being the important part of it. So as much as we say guns kill people, it's really the bullet that kills the person. And so if we regulate ammunition, you know, I think that's a much more important thing. It's incredibly safe. I mean, there's no way that this thing, unless one of us grabs and uses it as a blunt object, is going to hurt the other. We're entirely safe up here with this. If you put bullets in that, it's a very different conversation we're having up here on stage. And I'm moving a little farther back away from Joe.
Yeah, but look at the price they charge for ammunition now. And I can honestly say I've never killed anything but fleas on feral cats. So,
No, you killed the cat.
John? I did not kill the cat.
You killed the flea on the cat.
I killed the fleas. You damn right.
All right, John.
Okay, so there's one aspect, I don't know if it's just by accident, but we haven't talked about the religious aspect.
How's the weather?
So, some people, okay, so this part of the film really was interesting to me, maybe a bit nervous, because some people turn to religion perhaps when they're, you know, afraid of something, or are looking for answers, or, you know, for whatever reason. So I'm interested in your guys' thoughts on how intertwined religion and gun politics have come over the years, and you know, what do you think about that relationship and how that maybe plays into the things we're talking about? Yeah.
All right, so that's been the, yes.
I was surprised when, I didn't know this, when they were talking about how Ronald Reagan was the impetus, it seems, to bring the religious right over into the Republican Party. I didn't realize that, and it was kind of really threw me for that, but I don't know why that happened. I didn't go into it, but I
Democrats that are going to follow over and become Republicans, and there's a shift. I think that why they're, I don't know if this is the filmmaker's intention, but I think the idea of using Reagan is that it's a much more common, a much more recent memory that we would have to see the dynamic shift and see why you're going to see Democrats become Republicans, and you've got some, essentially blue rhinos who we would identify being more Democrat than anything else, but would become Republicans. But part of the importance of understanding Reagan and how politics evolved from that is understanding Nixon's war on drugs and essentially how that began as they get into ghettos and essentially try to to go in and take care of criminals and to really ramp up our approach to crime, our approach to drugs, and the complexity of the relationship between violence and drug use and revolution and how all of that plays in. And you see Reagan really continue that down into the idea of ramping up what we do to minor offenders and the idea of safety. We feel safe, and that was one of the things that was really important about the Reagan campaign is the restoring an order to America, bringing a safety to America, and that it was a more normalcy and a sort of calm. That video they showed about everybody hoisting up the flag, people being married and how happy, it was the idea of the white picket fence and that Reagan was going to approach that calmly, and that was a good Republican sentiment. I think that appealed to a lot of average, I don't mean it in a derogatory or pejorative way, but average Americans of bring back a calmer America, bring back a cooler-headed America. And that's where you see some party dynamics shifting.
Yeah, well, I was baptized and confirmed and married as a Roman Catholic, and I came on the fire department when I was 24, and I went on the rescue squad when I first got on, and I was ran both on the fire engine and on the rescue squad, and I saw a lot of things on both rigs. A lot of stuff made me question my faith, and I was on the fire department for 30 years, and I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, it's an interesting the way the movie kind of handled the issue. I think with evangelical Christians, the abortion issue is very cut and dry for a lot of the people. You saw him in his early activist days. He's marching there. That's what, that's pretty typical, in the sense that that's a big issue for them. What he did with the gun is basically coming the other way, because mostly the conservatives, historically the Republican Party is more the gun owners. I think if you took a query or a poll of the NRA membership across the country, it's going to be a majority would say that they vote Republican, that they're on the conservative end of that scale. So here you have a pastor that's coming forward, a reverend saying, basically throwing that around, saying, yeah, but if you're pro-gun, can you be pro-gun and pro-life at the same time? It was an interesting dynamic, and it's also interesting to see where a lot of times the issues don't really hit home for people until it hits home for that specific person for a personal reason. With him, it was the Navy Yard shooting because it happened in his neighborhood. That seemed to be the impetus to kind of force him into action. Obviously with Jordan's mother, she, being a Delta flight attendant, she probably, gun rights and gun activism was the last thing on her mind until she loses her son to gun violence, and then it's the forefront, as it probably should be. So it's interesting. I don't know what the lasting effects is. I'm curious to see what's been going on with the Reverend since this time, since the movie was done, because it looked like a lot of the footage was from 2014, so we're a couple years past that, and to see how he's now, I'd be curious just myself to go online to see what speeches he's given and what talks he's given after some of these other mass shootings that have come out and some of these incidents, and with President Obama's most recent talk about guns and some of the proposed legislation that he'd like to see passed.
I didn't know that I didn't feel the movie was really that successful in tying the two subjects together. They kind of touched on one, and then they kind of went the other way, and I didn't really see where there was any sort of a cause and effect.
Yeah, I think that they're trying to look at the value of life and how you could say that you're pro-life and obviously be not pro-choice, since those are the two opposites there, pro-life or pro-choice. How you can be pro-life but still be pro, for instance, stand your ground of I have the right to shoot someone and take someone's life, who is endangering me or threatening me in some way, or even if it's a perceived threat, that's okay in the mindset of people, but not terminating a pregnancy is not okay in the mindset of people. I think where the movie struggles with this, and maybe this is where we're struggling with it as a panel, is I think it's wrapped up in the language we use for that. And so when you talk about abortion, you're talking about pro-life or pro-choice. Those are two pros. So you generally have pro and con or pro and anti. And so with guns you have pro-gun or anti-gun. That's maybe a little easier to understand, but you still have to say, well, on what level of gun are you pro? Are you pro-gun for everything? Everybody should be standard issue a gun, and we have unfettered rights to guns, and we should be able to use everything. Or we take all guns away from everybody, and nobody has guns, not even the military. And so those are extremes. So we try to find some sort of common ground in the middle there. What's more particularly interesting about the abortion argument is that you have pro-life and pro-choice. Well, that assumes that the opposite of pro-life is anti-life. You're just pro-death. You want everybody to die. You just hate life. You're against that. If you're anti-life, so you say you're pro-life. Whereas pro-choice, you say you're anti-choice. Absolutely no choice for anybody. You can't have a choice in anything. So I think that's where it becomes particularly challenging looking at a gun issue, saying, well, you pro or anti-gun, and then on top of that, are you pro-life or anti-choice? I think that's where it's hard to overlay those two and to try to see the relationship between that, because it's such a complicated issue. And so there are so many shades of gray on both of those that it becomes too complicated to say, well, you can be pro-gun and anti-life, or anti-choice and pro-gun, and try to figure out what it means to be both of those. I think just calling our attention to it is an important thing that the film does do, and I wanted to acknowledge that. I've got two that way.
I think that one of the problems with a gun is it's an anonymous way to kill. And the perfect example of that is that Dunn who fired into loud music. But once you take personal combat away and allow death to become anonymous, or almost spontaneous, or racial, however you do it. I remember a guy that was a gun owner, and he even made his own bullets, and he was always in camo and stuff. It was just a big issue of his. But I said to him, if you really want to kill somebody, you should use a knife so that you can take personal responsibility for it. And because you cannot take personal responsibility with a bullet, not under a stand your ground or whatever. It's too easy to happen like that. A bullet
I don't know that I agree with you on the anonymity of shooting somebody, but I'm glad you said the word before I got to it, which is easier. I think that's part of it, is that it's much easier to pull a trigger than it is to go into a fist fight with somebody that is ultimately going to result in their death. And so that is a much harder struggle, perhaps a more personal struggle than it is to pull a trigger. And what I'm thinking of is how many 4, 5, 6, 7-year-olds that we read about who have no personal connection to a gun other than curiosity and go in and pull a trigger because it's easy to do that. I don't know that, maybe it's the media not reporting on it, but I don't know how many 4, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds are picking up a knife and managing to kill themselves with a knife compared to pulling a trigger and killing themselves. So I think that easier, maybe the word that applies more there, that it's easier to shoot a gun into a bunch of music and tinted windows because you might perceive a threat. That's something that's inherent in just being a human. That dates back to us in the plains of the Serengeti of, our hair stands up on the back of our necks because we think a saber-toothed tiger is in the brush. We still get goosebumps because we think we're making ourselves bigger. That's why animals puff up, is getting goosebumps. We don't have the hair to do that anymore, but it's still an evolutionary trait we have. So it's still there, but pulling a trigger is easier to have a response than imagine Michael Dunn running up to the car with a knife and trying to defend himself on the defense against a perceived threat. It's much, much different.
I think the problem that the pastor, the preacher had is that he didn't really grow up in any kind of a gun culture, and he had a proclivity of thinking that the people who had guns were prone to maybe want to shoot people, but I don't think there's any real disconnect in saying that, hey, I have guns and I'm in favor of protecting innocent people, whether they're in the womb or whether they're standing on the street. The responsible gun owners don't want to kill anybody. unless somebody is presenting a deadly danger to them. So I don't know. I think his dissonance or cognitive dissonance that he had about this may be a product of his own upbringing, his own life experience.
I think that one of the things that came out earlier in the panel, the importance of, like you said, they don't want to kill anybody until there's a threat, and then we get into another area of subjectivity of what's a threat, and let's stand your ground. What does that mean in Pennsylvania compared to how Florida interprets that? How much ground can you stand? Is your vehicle your personage where you can defend yourself from your vehicle? Is you just standing in a public park acceptable, that you feel threatened, that you can act out? And so, I think that's again where it becomes a language problem for us of what exactly is a threat, and then to what degree do we have the right to defend that perceived threat? And that's where we see ourselves wrapped up in the courtroom of, can you get 12 of your peers to agree that that was in fact a threat, or you were endangered, or that there was perceived danger, real or not?
Right.
And your hand up again. I don't know if you.
Okay. I was just thinking, it seems to me so mutually exclusive to say, as Lucy did, I will leave things that happen in the hands of the Lord, versus somebody who says, I will leave things that happen in my God. It seems to disconnect. Either you see one as your authority, or you see yourself as baptized by God to go out and do killing. I mean, those things are just so entirely irreconcilable.
Maybe that's a theological answer to the degree you believe God impacts your life. Of, if God has ultimate control over your life, you wouldn't need a gun or anything to protect you. God will be your shield for everything. But then there's also the argument that, well, God's created the human mind and the human to be self-sufficient, so therefore God's created the gun. And so in a way, God wants you to protect yourself with a gun. I'm not going to even begin to try to argue that one. But yeah, I think that boils down to how you believe and what you believe. And I think that's part of the challenge of the movie as well, is trying to address the complexity of religion. What do certain religions believe, and how do they interpret that?
But nobody addresses the issue as the Reverend does in trying to address both. The people who were for guns, that's all they wanted to talk about. They didn't want to talk about religion, even though they're ministers.
Well, it's a God-given right to have a gun. I think I heard that a couple of times. If I didn't, I heard it in my head at least, because it sounded like people were going to say that in the movie.
When they were talking, when the four of them got together, and the three of them, or two, the one gentleman was very pro-gun, very NRA. It wasn't four of them arguing. Reverend Shank, after a couple of minutes, realized it was going on. He just sat there, and the other three were really going at it tooth and nail. I thought they portrayed his struggle very well, and Lucy Davis, her part in that, really making him look at himself and think a little bit more seriously about it. I also wonder what you thought of the one parent after his son had been shot, and he asked Reverend Shank, where are the clergy in all this? That was kind of interesting. I know you said, but.
Yes, so I guess this thing is glued to my hand. I think his shutting down during that, really captures the frustration he has. I think it's similar to, I'd have to watch it again. I think it's similar to the look of not necessarily defeat, but just frustration that he has at Olive Garden, where they're having the dinner together, and he brings it up, and how pro-gun people are. I don't even know if he was expecting that, but just how pro-gun a person can be, and that it was an absolute. There was absolutely no room to talk about, whether or not they would rescind any of that. That it was, no, this is just how life is. before I pass off the mic to somebody else for that to try to answer it, I'll also say one of the things I think was troubling was just how white those audiences were and how absent race was from those conversations. So when we're talking to rural people about gun control, it just seemed to be a very white conversation from the film. I don't know if that's deliberate or by accident, but when you juxtapose that with the shooting of a black teenager by a white man, I think that's hard not to see, and I think that that's hard to interpret as well, as that this is very much an angry white guy problem. That's at least something I noticed in the film, that it seemed to be a focus on white men who were a little bit older.
Just on the way past, over to Mike, I'd just like to make the comment, we were talking just a few minutes ago about the tragedy of, 4, 5, 6-year-old kids getting a hold of guns and shooting themselves accidentally, and that is a terrible tragedy. I also, every summer, hear about 4 or 5, 6-year-old kids falling into ponds and falling into pools and drowning. And the difference between the two of those is when somebody falls into a pool, nobody's looking to drain all the swimming pools around. They always go after the people that were responsible for watching the child. And whenever now we have a child get shot, they primarily are saying, well, we should be doing something about the guns in the house. Yes?
I was gonna say that, I think you're required by law. I know in my neighborhood, somebody had built a house and then they added an in-ground pool. And you heard all these kids going around, playing in the pool, and I thought, I don't know how long that's going on. It wasn't 2 days later that the fence went.
Oh, it's a city ordinance, they have to have a fence around it, absolutely. And if the city ordinance weren't there, the insurance company sure would have them have a fence around. But it's a city ordinance, yes.
I just want to say real quick, that went back to what Ben was saying, and that is common in my household, is that had those children, as he was, at the age of 5, been taught to respect that weapon, that it was a serious piece of equipment, and not be able to handle it, and because otherwise it doesn't have the attraction of a forbidden fruit. I think if it's treated that way from the time the child is grown up, you don't run into those things because they're taught never point a gun, ever.
Always did with my kids.
Yeah.
At least twice a year, my kids, I would take the guns out and clean them. And my kids always helped me with that. They got to see them and hold them, and this is what they are, kids.
So it's
When we go out to the range and shoot them, sometime we can do that. And they were not forbidden fruit, they were not, something horrible. It was just something went out to the range and did. Put on your muscle and fought.
Yeah, I mean, in Pennsylvania, it's almost like a national pastime, and I think for a period of time that we were getting both the first day of buck and the first day of doe off in school, in secondary school, and so it just shows you, how ingrained that is in our culture, and it is so important to teach them early. If you have kids that are out there hunting by age 12, we saw the picture of the NRA convention of the one kid picking up a little gun. That's great as long as the parents are involved every step of the way. There's an uncle involved. There's a responsible person involved, showing them the respect for the gun. Proper safety, proper storage, proper everything. That's key. And the dinner scene there, the lunch scene. I mean, I had in my notebook there. I just wrote tray, like exclamation point, underline, because that caught me off guard. I mean, as soon as he started going, I thought either A, he had a lot of coffee in the morning, or he's got a cocaine habit, because for him to go from 0 to 10 like that on an issue but it just shows you again, it's kind of a microcosm of the country in a sense, where you have people that are just extremely, extremely passionate about this issue, and the trick is where you find the middle ground to try to find some reasonable solutions to some of the gun violence issues that we face here, and reaching across people that are both polar opposites of that spectrum.
If there's no quote-unquote dangers, why are the police, the security, allowed military-type weapons? Why are they having military-type vehicles that are coming into all the cities? Maybe not Erie as much, but these big MVs, and they're preparing for something. Why aren't the police allowed to shoot in the leg or the arm instead of the viscera? Why? If we can't have a weapon, a gun, why should they shoot to kill? I mean, that's what's going on. But we aren't supposed to.
You're not supposed to.
Well, it's not me. If I don't have any whistle.
Correct. mean, that's, as, you know, the Castle Doctrine that Dan mentioned, I mean, there's certain rights. Obviously, if you feel that your life is in danger or the life of somebody you're with is in grave danger, you have the right to defend yourself. As far as the militarization of police forces, I mean, I just know we obviously have SWAT teams. Every law enforcement agency has a SWAT team. ATF has regional SWAT teams for a reason, which is, you know, we go into some very, very bad situations with some very bad people who don't care about human life whatsoever, and we want to make sure that we can take every precaution we can going into that situation. If that means we have a vehicle that looks like a tank because we need to go, you know, ram a front door to save somebody from a house or something like that, we don't want our guys getting shot. You know, I'd like to know that my guys have the best equipment that's out there that's available. But then again, you look at scenes like the LA bank robbery from, I think, the late 90s, where you had these two guys completely tacked out in vests and helmets and with machine guns. And the police had to go to a local gun store in the neighborhood there because they were outgunned. They ran out of ammunition, that their firepower wasn't commensurate to the fight. And so that's what you find a lot of ways, because like we said, the bad guys, the laws are only pertain to the law-abiding people. The bad guys don't care about the laws whatsoever. So if they can convert their gun into a full-auto machine gun, well, then we come up across that in the street one day and we don't have that. I mean, I'm an ATF agent, I don't have a machine gun. So, you know, and again, it's one of those things where if an officer is going to carry something like that, he better be trained on how to use it properly, as opposed to just giving it to a brand new agent or rookie cop and saying, hey, here's your machine gun, go protect the peace.
And then a comment on that, the type of firearms that were available at the expo, stuff like that. I mean, I grew up watching Rambo movies, and you know, I recognize, you know, M16 and all the crazy, very powerful weapons there. I mean, so, you know, to talk about it as a hobby, you know, and a rifle to hunt. I mean, I grew up in the same environment. You know, this looks like it's a totally different level where people have access to. I mean, you know, in a few years when we have like, you know, bazookas and you know stuff like that to protect ourselves.
Yeah, and just people aware, like at the NRA shows like that, nobody's walking out with those items. None of that stuff is for sale there, but it's something what they're showing you is what's available. Like the SHOT Show in Las Vegas they have every year, and yeah, I mean, some of the stuff that's coming out right now looks more scary or looks more intense than some of the stuff that the military carries. And that's one of the things I think, you know, they're appealing to it's like anything, a cars production company, Ford, you know, General Motors, whoever, the sexier it looks, the more they're going to sell. You know, the more dangerous and scary and interesting a gun's going to look, the more they're going to sell like that. I mean, I know for a while there, Ruger and some of the other companies were coming out with pink and purple and other guns to appeal to the female buyers, and they were selling a ton of them. I visited the Ruger factory a couple years ago down in Arizona, and the day I was there, they were off the assembly line was ones that were called raspberry colored guns that were coming right off the line and going into a big bin that were going to be for sale. And so I think, yeah, it's like anything, any merchandise that, you know, they try to target to their audience and try to capitalize off and sell as much as they possibly can.
I was going to say, I think that in addition to the lesser use of guns and fatalities, for example, somebody mentioned Finland, but all of the European countries, you know, and the Asian countries, the UK, nobody has the kind of statistics we have here. But what just occurs to me along with this, sort of in passing, is that we also treat our old people very disrespectfully compared to, say, the European countries and even the Asian countries. But, you know, I think that if you cheapen life with use of guns, I don't know if it has any interplay with that, but America is very disrespectful of its underprivileged and its older people.
Just because they're one of the, I mean, that's different countries. It's interesting to see what happens. I mean, Australia has very restrictive gun policies. Canada has very restrictive gun policies, and obviously our rates are a lot higher. One of the things I thought was kind of missing from the film was, and Ben had touched on this a little bit, is kind of the media aspect of the fact that, you know, how much we glorify violence between our movies, our video games, things like that in the United States, where other people from other countries come and they see what's on our normal, you know, television, not even cable TV, and they're kind of appalled sometimes by what they see. And I just look from when I was a kid growing up, Pac-Man, and that was the big thing back then. Now, you have these first-person shooter games that are incredibly realistic, and you've got kids that are playing these games at age 8, 9, and 10, and what's that telling them about the sanctity of life and what it really means to be a firearm owner, to have a gun, and what kind of stuff is getting drilled into their head at the early age. And I think studies show that that's when the most meaningful lessons in a kid's life take place, is at the early age. That's what sticks. And so the fact that you've got kids that are getting some of these first-person shooter games, and they're seeing some of the garbage that's on television right now with the glorification of violence, that's what's frightening for the next generation coming up, and they just see that that's normal behavior.
Yeah, I just would add to that. I don't know if anybody else has any other questions, but I would add to that we certainly have a cultural problem with gun obsession and how we handle that. I don't know that there's a direct correlation between the age of population and gun control, but taking it back to European countries, Bass Lansdorp was here for the Jefferson's Global Summit in November, and during a dinner we had a really interesting conversation about gun control and what it looked like in the Netherlands, and that's where he's from. And interestingly enough, it came up because Bass Lansdorp, and this is what I would pose you to ask yourself when you go home at night, how would you answer this question? These came up over dinner. So Bass's thing is that he's the CEO of Mars One, which is a privately funded enterprise to do a one-way trip to Mars. So kind of like Elon Musk, but the European version of that. And so go colonize Mars, one-way trip. So of course, the American question that came up about 30 seconds into dinner was, do you take guns? And he said, that's a really American question. Because this guy goes throughout the globe to give this talk. He goes, this is a really American question. And he said, I'll answer it with a question. Why do you think you need guns? So the room kind of got quiet, and what inevitably started coming up first, and maybe this was just the sample size we were with, but it was defense. It wasn't hobby, it wasn't recreation. And so what are you defending yourselves from? Because the scary answer in our heads, we're thinking, well, we've seen the sci-fi movies. The aliens are popping out from the dark spark of Mars that we've never seen. We know there's not freaking life on Mars, okay? We're going to be the only life on Mars. So that essentially implies we're taking guns to protect ourselves from each other. Should we go to a whole separate planet and still not be able to tolerate each other as human beings, that one of us has to shoot the other one? That's a really scary thing. As I think you have to ask yourself, if you went to Mars, would you take a gun? And if you would, why? Is it for safety? Is it for hobby? Do you feel like this is essential to being a human being in a controlled environment? If we removed all threats, because really the only threat is your helmet coming off on Mars. You get up there, they're not aliens. We've figured that out by now. If you go to Mars, do you take a gun? If so, why? That's how you feel about guns.
Hey, Ben, you're absolutely right. We're barbarians, right?
Yeah, kind of are.
We have been fighting, with something, whether it's guns or anything, from the time of Cain and Abel. You want to get back to the Bible, okay?
Yeah.
And I believe if we had laws that weren't manipulated so much, and people can believe in it, I mean, we're always going to protect ourselves, but we wouldn't have to use it against each other. Whether it's guns.
One last thing
If
that
we could all just get along, I think that's yeah, all just get along.
I mean, that's
Rodney's
one
dead.
of the hard things to do.
I kind of thought the question would come up today, so I looked up a couple of figures today, John. We were talking about why people are looking at those rifles and why they had so many of them at the NRA convention. And there are literally dozens.
The big assault.
Yeah, exactly, the big assault weapons. And there are literally dozens of manufacturers making weapons on that same platform as the AR-15 basis, which is taken from the military M16, the semi-automatic form of that. And the reason for that is because, according to the National Shooting Sports Foundation, 60% of all the rifles sold in the past couple of years have been AR-15 style rifles. Of all the rifles sold in the country. And according to their calculations, they're not exactly sure of all the guns sold, but they estimate that 25% of all the guns sold in the country have been AR-15 style rifles. That's why you see so many of them on the floor there, because that's what's selling, that's where all the money's being made.
So perhaps that answers the question about the militarization of the police force.
Well, they
We're
have
all
to,
running
yeah.
around with.
We're primitive social animals that men drilled the roar.
When did it stop?
When we go to Mars.
I think
Apparently not.
As long as it's one way, they can take all the guns.
Yeah, there's a one-way trip. Only 2,000 people signed up for that thing.
And, well, I was just gonna say, I know I mentioned earlier, for anybody that actually has firearms here that wants one of these ATF firearms records, it's just a sheet that you can keep track of your make, model, caliber, serial number. It's a great tool to have, so if you are, you know, heaven forbid, ever a victim of a burglary, your guns are stolen, you can hand that right to the police officer when they show up at your door and say, here's what was taken from my house, and they can immediately get that in the system. I can send it to you via email, so if you want to see me in the back, give me an email address and I can email it to you, or if you want to give me an address and I can mail you a copy of the form. I can mail you as many as you want.
Thank you, guys.
Because